reaction time. Time to react, Andrew. So, let's start with a long one. Why not? Why not? We got a sizzler. What a picture. What a start. This is a 90-minute one. A little less than 90 minutes, but it's about RFK and or RFK Jr. and all sorts of the debauchery that he's done and is involved in. So it's important that you guys know, if I'm honest. So let's listen in and see how this train wreck is.
Another bizarre story involving former presidential candidate RFK Jr. and this one involves a whale.
It is a story you cannot make up.
This is a guy who has found himself in the middle of some unusual controversies.
The man simply could shock you.
This man is actually running for president.
A Vanity Fair report is leveling serious claims against independent presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
No, Kennedy, nobody has to spin anything to make this look weird.
Who says this is a boring campaign?
This was uploaded 8 months ago, by the way.
I believe that I would have won the election.
It was a crisp autumn day in Central Park when a woman by the name of Florence Slatkin made a disturbing discovery.
The discovery of a black bear by a dog walker just a few feet from Central Park's main jogging and bike path today was alarming and strange.
The Upper West Side resident was out walking her dog, Paco, when the two came across what appeared to be a dead bear cub sprawled out under some bushes, its head resting firmly on top of a bicycle wheel. It was a mystifying sight, considering the bike was left abandoned, and bears have not been known to roam Manhattan since at least the 1600s. This happened in 2014, so the only place you could find a bear around that area would have been the Central Park Zoo, who confirmed to police that none of their animals had gone missing, which only left investigators with even more questions. An autopsy quickly confirmed it was struck and killed by a car, but there was no explanation for how the cub actually got there. As one expert told the New York Times a decade ago, bears are not going to go through a city if it's not continuous green space from wherever it came from to Central Park. It seems unlikely that the bear got lost and wandered there, concluding it must have been killed someplace else before being dumped off at the park. The most glaring question of all, though, was who could have staged such an unnecessary and depraved scene involving a deceased baby animal? Well, after a decade of speculation, we have our culprit.
And that woman in van in front of me hit a bear and killed it. A young bear.
Yes, in front of me.
Yes. Attempting to get ahead of an upcoming article, independent presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr. uploaded the video to Twitter confessing to scooping up the young cub's body after the car in front of him had apparently hit and killed it. Upon pulling over, Kennedy determined the body was in such good condition, in fact, that he made plans to skin the animal and keep its meat in his freezer. After all, that's where he keeps the rest of his roadkill he collects. What an amazing treasure trove of smells that has to be. Only he wasn't exactly able to get home fast enough. After all, he was already on his way to a falconry event, couldn't miss that, and had a big expensive dinner planned in Manhattan later that night.
Could not miss that.
Time had gotten away from him, and he was suddenly stuck with a dead bear rotting in the back of his car shortly before he needed to catch a plane. Which, if I had to imagine, it can't be easy trying to squeeze a cadaver into an overhead bin. Kennedy needed to get rid of this thing fast. So he and his not-so-sober buddies at the time decided it would be a great little bit to stage a biking accident with the corpse. He says cyclists had apparently been receiving a lot of negative press at the time and hoped that whoever found the body would laugh and get a big kick out of it. Somehow. I mean, does anyone actually believe a bicycle could kill a bear anyway? This is the kind of prank you would expect from a group of frat kids that get kicked out of college, not a 60-year-old aristocrat and his rich friends.
We went hawking and I had the bear in my car. And then we had a really good day and we went late. We were catching a lot of game and the people really loved it, so we stayed late. And instead of going back to my home in Westchester, I had to go right to the city because there was a dinner. at Peter Luger's Steakhouse. It went late, and I realized I couldn't go home. I had to go to the airport.
In his cinematic retelling of this fateful night, Kennedy spares us no detail. I mean, he's sitting in a kitchen with Roseanne Barr, of all people.
My pronouns are kiss my...
describing an event that I'm sure plenty of regular, working-class American voters won't have any trouble relating to or understanding. Scraping a dead bear carcass off the side of the road that you plan to eat only after you've allowed it to marinate in your sweltering hot car for 7 hours is a pretty universal experience, I think. It is pretty fun to play around with the decaying animal remains if your last name happens to be Dahmer. Even taking the opportunity to pose for a cute little photo with his finger in its mouth that I'm not gonna risk showing you here for obvious reasons. If nothing else, this story does recontextualize these RFK Jr. themed teddy bears he's been selling on his website since April. It's pretty rare that you have a situation come full circle like this. When Tatiana Schlossberg wrote this initial article,
how did they figure that out? Like, I'm curious how they,
my 15th birthday. I doubt she could imagine the culprit to be her own cousin. Yeah, the person who broke this story 10 years ago is JFK's granddaughter. These people are related. The Kennedys are everywhere, which might be unfortunate for bears. But that also means the country at large has been unable to escape this man's absolutely ripped physique for the duration of a campaign that has proven to be nothing short of an absolute trip. If you've been paying any attention at all to this unprecedented, at times horrifying ride of an election cycle, then you're probably already somewhat familiar with RFK Jr.'s shenanigans, let's call them. These shenanigans are, of course, known to include, but are not limited to, 9/11 trutherism, linking school shootings to antidepressants, asserting Wi-Fi is connected to cancer, being accused of sexual assault and eating a dog but only denying the eating a dog thing, having literal worms in his brain, and spreading so much misinformation on vaccines that he has since been associated with a fatal measles outbreak on the island of Samoa. With all of this combined, it's no wonder he's been the subject of so many bizarre headlines. For the most part, RFK Jr. is like a weird specter looming in the background of a nasty showdown that sees Donald Trump and Kamala Harris at its center. Above everything else, we know that whoever takes the White House this November, it will not be RFK Jr. But with the numbers he's managed to pull, which are actually impressive for a third-party candidate, or at least that was the case for a little while before he dropped out and endorsed Trump. But because he'll be remaining on the ballot in so many states, it's hard for me to say his presence won't bear any consequence on the electoral outcome whatsoever, pun very much intended. And I think because of this, along with his shameless attempts to weasel his way into the cabinet of whoever wins, it's worth taking a closer look at his policies and background. And I can promise you that after countless painstaking hours of research that have included watching him spew randomized buzzwords at Joe Rogan for a prolonged period of time and in seemingly no particular order,
Wi-Fi radiation does all kinds of bad things, including causing cancer.
Wi-Fi radiation causes
from your cell phone. I mean, there's cell phone tumors. Wi-Fi radiation opens up your blood-brain barrier. And so all these toxins that are in your body can now go into your brain.
How does Wi-Fi radiation open up
Wi-Fi radiation?
Now you're going beyond my expertise.
Kennedy is even more of an enigma than I had originally thought. Such an unusual trajectory, though, might lend itself to the fact that he's lived a life that is far from normal. Kennedy has spent his entire 70 years on this planet in the limelight because, well, he's a f***ing Kennedy. His father, the Attorney General, and his uncle, the President, were only slightly important people. Even today, the Kennedys are seen as American royalty. RFK Jr. descends from a long line of political leaders spanning as far back as the early 1900s. And with that extensive lineage comes a lot of notoriety. This is a family wrought by scandal after scandal, tragedy after tragedy. Entire articles have been compiled online documenting their long history of untimely deaths and calamities. There's even a term for this phenomenon, the Kennedy curse, coined shortly after then-Senator Ted Kennedy drove his Oldsmobile off a bridge, plunged into a river, and killed a secretary, effectively tanking his chances of ever winning the presidency when it was revealed he waited 10 hours to report the young woman's death to authorities. When you look back at the Camelot mythos, you find no shortage of controversy.
Nothing bad ever happens to the Kennedys. Wow!
But that hasn't stopped them from pursuing careers in public service right up to the modern era. Take, for example, JFK's only grandson, Jack Schlossberg, a 31-year-old Harvard graduate who currently works as the sole political correspondent for Vogue, in between singing along to Charlie XCX on TikTok. My favorite thing about Jack Schlossberg is anytime he tries to talk about serious political issues, which is, you know, his job, the comment section is just filled to the brim with whatever you say, beautiful, blah, blah, blah. I told my parents about us. No one actually cares what he's saying. They just want to look at his face and hear him do goofy voices.
The devil you know is heaps better than the devil you don't know.
Imagine if you could go back in time and tell the 35th president of the United States that in the year 2024, his only grandson has carried on the family legacy by doing this.
Everybody get down if you feel me. Put your hands up to the ceiling. Everybody get down if you feel me. Put your hands up.
Who the fuck is that?
Everybody get down if you feel me. Put your hands up to the ceiling.
With the bluey sunglasses, dude.
Hey, Mr. DJ, somebody read me.
Truly the people's princess. But Jack isn't the only Kennedy to stand out among the 105 living relatives who make up the sprawling Catholic dynasty today. One of the most currently talked about members of the Kennedy clan is, of course, the subject of this video, RFK Jr., who spent most of his childhood in Virginia at the luxurious Hickory Hill estate, which has been depicted as somewhat of an extension of the Kennedy White House. It's where his uncle and father would do a lot of their work when they weren't on Capitol Hill, described by one frequent visitor as a wild mixture of a children's playground, upbeat discotheque, and a humming political headquarters. Filled to the brim with all kinds of different animals, this is where RFK Jr. would develop a love of falconry, his father buying him his very first hawk as a way to cheer him up after the 11-year-old injured his leg jumping off a roof. From everything I've read, Hickory Hill was a sort of utopia for the Kennedy children, an oasis for them to escape the media's constant hounding, serving as the perfect backdrop to an idealistic childhood that many would be lucky to experience. Tragically, however, that reality wouldn't last forever.
CBS News special report on the California primaries. Here is Walter Cronkite.
The polls have just closed in California's presidential primary, and a special CBS News survey of voters leaving the polling places indicates that Senator Robert F. Kennedy is leading solidly in the Democratic race with almost 50% of the vote.
This is a big deal. This is a big deal that he died. My dad talks about how tragic it was.
Kennedy Sr. gave a speech at the Ambassador Hotel.
My dad says this was like a big fucking problem, like a huge deal.
Primary, trouncing his main rival Eugene McCarthy and vowing to continue fighting all the way up to the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, where an official nominee was to be crowned.
Why is it a big deal?
My thanks to all of you.
Because he was like, I mean, he's a Kennedy. That's why it's a big. I mean, he's the Jay Aubrey here kind of already went over it. Like
Chris Pratt married into the Kennedy family. That fucker is everywhere. There is no escaping him.
Oh shit! What did I just do? Accidentally went too far ahead. There we go. Found it somehow. Yeah, it's a big deal. Like, it's not the equivalent, but like how people regard the royal family in England. That's kind of how a lot of Americans see a Kennedy. Not exactly the same. Not royalty, but like political importance. Like, and Robert F. Kennedy was John F. Kennedy's brother. John F. Kennedy was the president who got assassinated. Robert F. Kennedy was the attorney general. So he ran for president after his brother's death and was like a prominent political figure just due to his already big experience as attorney general. But then he was basically going to be the Democratic nominee and win. Like it was like no doubt in a lot of people's mind that he was easily going to win the election.
And vowing to continue fighting all the way up to the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, where an official nominee was to be crowned.
Yeah, kind of like Princess Diana a little bit, yeah.
Thanks to all of you, and now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there.
Kennedy was fatally shot only a few moments after this clip.
Yep.
The gunman, by the name of Sirhan, had ambushed the senator in a kitchen just seconds after he left the podium. As he was shaking hands with voters, multiple shots rang out, and Kennedy slumped to the ground. Chaos ensued as panicked supporters and journalists tried to make sense of what had just occurred.
That was the exact moment that the shots were fired, at least 6 shots, according to the reports we have. Fired at Senator Kennedy, Paul Schrade, other people on the speaker's platform. Obviously, pandemonium erupted.
Kennedy was rushed to the Good Samaritan Hospital, where he was pronounced dead the following day. This event not only altered the course of American history, but was obviously hugely consequential to the Kennedy family. His 13-year-old son, David, was up late past his bedtime that night, watching the speech alone from a hotel room where he witnessed his father's murder on live television. According to reports, nobody checked in on him until 3 hours later, being found with the TV still on, unable to speak. Now, it's important to note here that RFK Jr. does not agree with the government's conclusion of events from that night. He once spoke to Sirhan face-to-face in prison and is adamant that he could not have been the only shooter. In fact, he's gone so far as to call the man innocent, even advocating for his parole, which California Governor Gavin Newsom struck down in 2022. Kennedy finds it hard to believe that anyone who reads the autopsy report would come away thinking that Sirhan, who was standing in front of his father, could have fired the shot that killed him, which entered his head from behind his ear at point-blank range. Authorities, of course, have countered this by insisting his head was turned at the time of the gunshots. You see, Kennedy is of the belief that his father was assassinated by a bodyguard standing directly behind him, claiming the man was a CIA operative and pointing to the fact that there was no real trial for Sirhan. But that's where we've got to take a pause, because if we were here to discuss all the juicy details of the Kennedy assassinations, this video would be about 6 hours long. There are so many factors that would need to be included in order to paint an accurate picture of what happened, and we've already got enough on our plate for now. But I have to admit, it is enthralling to entertain, and it sure isn't out of character for the CIA to handle a world leader. And I see why RFK Jr. has made the assassinations of his uncle and father such a vital point of his campaign. But speculating on the true killers of RFK and JFK doesn't quite put the general public at risk in the same way his other theories do. And trust me, we'll get to those in a little while. What we do know is that RFK Jr. had flown in from his boarding school to be with his dad the day he died. This was an especially painful tragedy for him, considering how close he always was to his father compared to his mother, Ethel, writing in a 2018 memoir that her exceptional qualities were mainly invisible to me as a child, and noting that from my angle, her love didn't always feel unconditional. Coming from such a politically active family, it's hard for me to imagine he didn't feel pressured to carry on the Kennedy legacy in some capacity, especially in the immediate aftermath of his father's murder. As Vanity Fair writer Joe Hagan pointed out, of all Bobby Sr.'s children, the namesake son was considered the most promising dynastic heir. Square-jawed and twinkly-eyed, he looked and sounded the most like his father. Hagan also brought up an old quote from JFK's former roommate at Harvard, Lem Billings, who had become pretty close to the young Kennedy after the assassinations. Everywhere a boy like Bobby looks, he said, there are footprints, all deeper than his own.
I started doing drugs after my dad died.
Okay, to try to cope with the loss?
Oh, who knows? I mean, I feel, honestly, that I was born an addict, and that, you know, I would have, no matter what happened, I probably would have gone that way. But who knows? You know, you can't, there's no way to reconstruct that.
RFK Jr. has been incredibly upfront about his drug addiction that began when he was just 15, a year after the tragedy. Throughout the rest of his teens and 20s, Kennedy would struggle with a crippling substance addiction that included meth, speedballs, and mostly heroin. His addiction wasn't helped by Billings, who writer David Horowitz said would often accompany Kennedy on trips to shady areas of Harlem to score heroin. In his 1984 book, The Kennedys, an American Drama, Horowitz also includes testimony from a woman named Jennifer Jacobson, who dated Kennedy's cousin Chris while the boys were in college. Of the young men's addiction, she stated, Christopher and Bobby, RFK Jr., liked heroin, but they'd settle for a cupful of Valium, some Percodins, or whatever else was there. Drugs were obsessive. There was a desperate need to escape. Most of us who do dope just want to leave our lives behind. You got the feeling that whatever they said they wanted to leave their whole ancestry behind. A 1984 edition of Playboy magazine also touched on this as well, describing how Bobby, Chris, and David would sometimes panhandle for money at Grand Central Station to buy drugs. David reportedly telling the magazine it was great just being ordinary people and not Kennedys. Playboy also reported that it was Bobby who introduced his younger brother David to heroin. According to RFK Jr. biographer Jerry Oppenheimer, Kennedy not only force-fed LSD to his pet parakeet growing up, but he also forced David to trip on the psychedelic mescaline. Oppenheimer writes that when David started hallucinating, he became convinced that his brother was dying in front of him, screaming, "You're dying just like Daddy." On April 25th, 1984, David Kennedy would be found dead of a drug overdose in a Palm Beach hotel room at 28 years old. This was also soon after the family had reportedly turned on David for airing out their dirty laundry to the media, according to a recent Vanity Fair piece. RFK Jr. himself suffered an overdose in September 1983, becoming violently sick in an airplane restroom and being charged with 1 count of heroin possession in South Carolina, garnering national headlines considering Kennedy was the assistant Manhattan district attorney at the time, despite failing the bar twice. After 15 years of on and off using, this was a pivotal moment in the 29-year-old's life, attempting to move past these dark times by going to rehab and spending his 1,500 hours of court-mandated community service volunteering at an environmental group called the National Resources Defense Council. This is where Kennedy would finally begin to feel a sense of purpose. For once in his life, he actually found fulfillment in holding big polluters accountable. Working pro bono for a time, Kennedy fought to clean up lakes and riverways by shining a spotlight on illegal dumping, ironic, and advocating on behalf of Native Americans fighting for the conservation of their land, even being arrested with actress Daryl Hannah in 2013 for opposing the Keystone Pipeline, which is in stark contrast to potentially lying about being attacked by an indigenous tribe in 1976. Emphasis on it potentially, because there really is no way for me to officially verify this next claim other than just telling you who said what. According to what Kennedy told journalists many decades ago, he and his cousin Chris were whitewater rafting when they were ambushed by a tribe. He says an arrow pierced one of their canteens and narrowly missed his cousin's leg. As Kennedy scrambled to find more arrows to retaliate with, Chris heroically pulled out a random stick of dynamite that I guess he just had on him conveniently, lighting the stick and throwing it at the tribe. It blew, shooting water 30 feet in the air and sending their attackers running for the hills. Only, as the Huffington Post recently put it, this recollection appears to be wildly exaggerated or entirely made up. Comparing Kennedy's story to a similar but less cinematic incident from Chris's 2005
I just have dynamite in my
where
pocket.
Chris wrote of arrows being shot in their general direction by a drunken tribe on the shore, which is only a little less grandiose than fighting back with explosive materials like Looney Tunes, but even Chris's recollection is up for debate. See, Huffington Post quoted another one of Bobby's friends, Blake Fleetwood, who claimed to be on the trip as well, telling the Washington Post in 1984 that the water was calm all day and no such attack ever occurred, going on the record all the way back then that Kennedy's claim was just fantasy. Strangely, for whatever reason, the Kennedy campaign has still not responded to questions from the Huffington Post. Somehow, though, this isn't even the wildest story to come out of Kennedy's surreal fever dream of a personal life. No, not even close. Kennedy's arsenal doesn't stop at just dynamite, evidently. No, it turns out he also likes to use chainsaws to decapitate beached whales. This fun little tidbit comes from his own daughter, Kick Kennedy, who recently told Town and Country magazine that when she was a kid, she remembers her father learning of a whale that had washed up nearby, slicing off its head and bungee cording it to the roof of the family minivan before taking it back to their home in New York, which was 5 hours away. Recalling how every time we accelerated on the highway, whale juice would pour into the windows of the car, and it was just the rankest thing on the planet. We had plastic bags over our heads with mouth holes cut out, and people on the highway were giving us the finger, but that was just normal day-to-day stuff for us. Normal day-to-day stuff? What the f? is this family?
What?
I mean, if this is just now coming to light, imagine what all we still have yet to learn about. Regardless, Kennedy's environmental activism throughout the 1980s is what largely legitimized him, if you ask Alex Boyle, a student who worked with the young lawyer on several projects at Riverkeeper, a patrol group that monitored and reported polluters on the Hudson River, as written in The New Yorker, which also noted that Kennedy began a lucrative speaking career around this time. Throughout the late 80s and 90s, Kennedy was paid 6 figures to travel around the United States, emphasizing the importance of environmental protection. He'd attend all kinds of charity events and fundraisers well into the 2000s, which he documented extensively in his own personal diary. But mind you, these weren't the only stories he'd record in that diary.
1994, you married Mary Kathleen Richardson. According to reports, it said that she had found a personal journal of yours where you had written down various encounters, sexual encounters with 37 different women. And that possibly triggered her to take her own life. Would you care to comment on that at all?
Yeah.
What Vlad is talking about here is a 2013 report from the New York Post, which revealed Kennedy's habit of documenting the names of his many mistresses in a journal, referring to his greatest defect being his lust demons. This diary was discovered by his late wife, Mary Richardson, who also found additional messages of him sexting other women.
I'm sorry,
phone,
babe.
according
My
to what a
lust
friend told the New
demons.
Yorker. The diary depicted encounters with over 30 different women in 2001 alone, often using vague terminology along with a numerical system that corresponded with different sex acts. The number 10, for example, meant intercourse. The Post reported that 16 of the women named were marked with 10s. Kennedy was traveling all over the continent at the time and recorded a 2, a 3, and a 10 all on the same day in November while attending a celebrity charity event. One woman was named 22 times, meeting up with her 13 days in a row, according to the entries. He also seems to use the word mugged to say he was seduced by these women, making himself out to be a victim of sorts, as the Post notes, when he writes of being mugged on his way home from a dinner with Leonardo DiCaprio. One entry reads, "I narrowly escaped being mugged by a double team of 2 women. It was tempting, but I prayed, and God gave me the strength to say no." Another entry, dated shortly after September 11th, 2001, states, "Despite the terrible things happening in the world, my life is great. So I've been looking for ways to screw it up. I'm like Adam and live in Eden, and I can have everything but the fruit is all I want." He would mark the days he wasn't unfaithful with the word victory and would tell himself he needed to avoid the company of women. You have to resist their charms. Be humble like a monk. Keep your hands to yourself. Avert your eyes. Throughout most of the infidelity described here, Kennedy's wife of 7 years, Mary, was at home pregnant with their 4th child, which is probably why, when confronted by the media about the diary in 2013, Kennedy seemed so taken aback. The Post says he sat in stunned silence for 6 whole seconds before finally retorting, "I don't think there is any way you could have a diary or journal of mine from 2001. I don't have any comment on it. I have no diary from 2001. Before, of course, admitting the diary was real to DJ Vlad here a decade later.
The journal that you're talking about is called Your Fifth Step. It was part of my, my recovery, and I kept that 5th step in a safe. She put a lot of effort into getting that safe open and then handing that to her sisters with instruction that if anything happened to her, it should be published in the press.
Kennedy's rampant infidelity caused a severe rift in his marriage. The New Yorker described Mary's inability to cope with his sex addiction, as one friend told the publication that Mary believed if he had only gone back into recovery, then maybe their marriage would have been saved. Unfortunately, things did not get better, and they filed for divorce in 2010. During the proceedings, Mary tragically took her own life. Kennedy, as it was reported, had been attempting to get full custody of the kids, and a leaked affidavit from him seemed to depict Mary as an abusive alcoholic who had been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. Mary's family, though, strongly rebukes this depiction and the diagnosis, telling Newsweek in 2012 that the affidavit, which Mary repudiated at the time, is full of vindictive lies. This latest piling on is proof perfect of the unbelievable emotional emotional and psychological abuse that Mary endured during the last years of her life, and now in death. The false claim that Mary suffered from BPD is also an insult to those who do struggle with this serious mental illness. According to writer Maureen Callahan, Kennedy had approached Mary's therapist at one point, asking her to be diagnosed as mentally ill. The therapist refused and reportedly told him, "Your wife isn't mentally ill. She is angry and depressed, but she is not ill." The New Yorker also stated that although Mary's family wanted her remains to be
Imagine thinking that your wife is upset for a genuine reason, not because they have a mentally ill problem. Imagine that. Whoa. Wait. Wife mad at me because real valid reason? I don't know.
Be buried near her home in Westchester. Kennedy insisted she be buried at the Kennedy plot in Cape Cod. Mary's family sued, but Kennedy ultimately won, denying his ex-wife's grieving family their final request for their loved one.
That's crazy.
In one particularly transparent entry, Kennedy wrote, "After Daddy died, I struggled to be a grown-up. I felt he was watching me from heaven. Every time I was afflicted with sexual thoughts, I felt a failure. I hated myself. I began to lie, to make up a character who was the hero and leader that I wished I was." Later writing, "I have been given everything that I coveted. A beautiful wife and kids and loving family, wealth, education, good health, and a job I love, yet always on the lookout for something I can't have. I want it all. No matter how much I have, I want more."
Damn.
Kennedy isn't the only person in this story, though, who's kept a diary. Eliza Cooney began babysitting for the Kennedys at the age of 23, and in a diary of her own recently obtained by Vanity Fair, Cooney described multiple unwanted sexual encounters with the 44-year-old Kennedy. The first entry, dated November 7th, 1998, reads, "From everything everybody says about the Kennedys, plus their babysitters, they had me worried. Like I have to watch out, be careful. And the other night in the kitchen with Murray, a volunteer for Riverkeeper, I could have sworn Kennedy was touching my leg and hand. It seemed like he thought I was somebody else or wasn't paying attention. Like he would come to every once in a while and snap out of it, or I would move away. It was like he was on something, or really tired, or was missing Mary, or was testing me." Cooney told Vanity Fair that in the back of her mind, she was hoping it wasn't what it actually was. Unfortunately, though, this was not a one-off occurrence. Just a few weeks after this entry, Vanity Fair reports that Cooney discovered Kennedy standing in her bedroom. The diary that contained intimate details about her relationship with her boyfriend was opened on the bed. Kennedy, shirtless, asked if she could rub lotion on his back, the magazine reports. She obliged reluctantly, but soon stopped recording these events in her diary out of fear that he would read them. The third and most horrifying encounter, though, happened a few months later in Kennedy's kitchen, where Cooney says that she was cornered from behind. As written in Vanity Fair, Kennedy came up behind her, blocked her inside the room, and began groping her, putting his hands on her hips and sliding them up along her ribcage and breasts. Finally, being interrupted by a worker who reportedly told Kennedy something to the effect of, "Don't do anything I wouldn't do," according to Cooney.
Bruh.
You would naturally expect a candidate running for the highest office in the land to address such serious allegations head on, and you would hope that if they were truly innocent of what was being alleged, they would rush to vehemently deny it across the board. But Kennedy hasn't done this. Sure, he's addressed it because he has to, but his response hasn't done much to actually put normal people at ease. If his goal was to exonerate himself of the claims being made against him, I'm gonna say he kind of failed that little mission.
Listen, I've said this from the beginning. I am not a church boy. I had a very, very rambunctious youth.
I'm sorry, but youth? Buddy, you were a few years away from qualifying for a full AARP membership. Also, the word rambunctious should never appear anywhere near your response to sexual assault allegations. Why'd you have to throw that in?
I said in my announcement speech that I have so many skeletons in my closet that if they could all vote, I could run for king of the world.
And to cap off his insane ramblings with "I am who I am" is just the cherry on top.
I am who I am.
You're talking there about the nanny situation. I mean, I do have to ask her. I mean,
creeping on somebody 2 decades younger than you is pretty fucking gross.
I'm not going to comment on it.
All right.
Well, I guess RFK Jr. is innocent after all, guys. Case closed. As we all know, innocent people always directly refuse to comment on something they didn't do. If you're being accused of a serious crime that you absolutely 100% did not commit, the correct move is to obviously go out of your way to say that you are not commenting on it. But if that doesn't say enough, reports quickly came out that he had actually texted Cooney an apology where he claims to have not remembered the events she described, but is sincerely sorry for any harm he may have caused her. Obviously, Cooney hasn't accepted this. It's a non-apology, or as she put it,
I'm sorry if I did that.
And arrogant. Telling the Washington Post, I'm not sure how somebody has a true apology for something that they don't admit to recalling. I didn't get a sense of remorse. And I also just have to say, really not what Kennedy's reputation needed after it had just been reported that he went on Jeffrey Epstein's private plane with his family to go fossil hunting. I don't know how people thought this guy was going to stand up to the deep state or whatever when he's first of all a Kennedy and has also hung out with the deep state.
Literally the deep state.
This guy flew with Ghislaine Maxwell, dude. But not to fear, as he does for every question, Kennedy of course had a marvelous explanation locked and loaded when pressed by Andrew Schultz.
Okay, but give the context obviously to the Epstein thing, because you basically got out ahead of the...
When I run into everybody in New York, I mean, I knew Harvey Weinstein, I knew Roger Ailes, I knew O.J. Simpson came to my house, Bill Cosby came to my house.
You also knew good people.
Yeah. Like, hey man, you know you didn't have to tell us any of that, right? I mean, on one hand, I see why some people might appreciate a politician being so open and honest about the skeletons in their closet. You know, the ones that could elect him king of Earth. But I'm not sure how much that transparency actually helps him in this case. Happily telling millions of people that you kicked it with the Avengers of murder and sex crimes is not exactly the part of your past you want to emphasize when you're running for president. The wildest part is he's not even the only presidential candidate this year who once palled around with Epstein, but you can learn more about that in my other videos. If anything, such a bizarre answer just kind of proves his point that maybe he did have part of his brain eaten by a worm. I know people like to jokingly accuse each other of having brain worms on Twitter and stuff, whatever, but RFK Jr. literally had one, at least according to what he said in the 2012 deposition, wherein he tried to use his brain fog to get out of paying child support to Mary, but that's just another fun little detail. As he told a judge back then, I have cognitive problems, clearly. I have short-term memory loss, and I have longer-term memory loss that affects me. Attributing this fogginess to a parasite that had crawled into his brain, taken a bite out of it, and died. Kennedy originally thought this spot on his brain was a tumor. Kennedy also informed the judge of an apparent mercury poisoning diagnosis that he attributed to probably eating too much fish. The Times pointing to another quote from the deposition where Kennedy alluded to tuna fish sandwiches taking up a significant portion of his diet. Like, yeah, I mean, that's gonna do it. Rest assured though, Kennedy insisted his brain fog had miraculously dissipated by the time he started running for public office, never treating the brain worm. Kennedy's campaign has responded to concern over the candidate by saying, that's a hilarious suggestion given the competition. And I will admit, seeing that this article came out all the way back in May when his two main competitors weren't exactly the beacons of mental fortitude.
I say, what would happen if the boat sank from its weight?
I mean, as we evolve our institution, drive creative new partnerships.
And there's a shark. There's a shark 10 yards away from the boat.
Certain principles of our international system are sacrosanct.
But you know what I'd do if there was a shark? I'll take electrocution every single time. I'm not getting near the shark.
I get why she said that, but I also mean the bar is kind of on the floor here. Still though, as this Times article points out, health experts say the consequences of a brain-eating parasite, along with mercury poisoning, can leave lingering effects on a person that may end up being permanent. That's not always the case.
You mean something eating a whole chunk of your brain would cause a permanent problem? Yeah. Yeah, it would. No, yeah, maybe a little bit. Maybe a little bit.
Mind you, but it does happen. Now, where he got the worm is beyond my speculation. It could have been anywhere. It's literally anywhere. In high school, he used to play around in piles of dead cows. Yeah, yeah. According to what a friend told biographer Jerry Oppenheimer, next to the school, there was a cow pit where the local dairy farmers threw their dead cows, and it was full of rats. Bobby would take his hawk and go hunting rats in the midst of the rotting cow carcasses. So, it could have been from that. Or it could have been from the time he took a trip to Peru and contracted dysentery, where, as Oppenheimer also writes, Kennedy ate anything and everything, including boiled rat, pulling out the eyes from the dead rodent's head and popping them into his mouth, which I know is a disturbing mental image, but not any more disturbing than this actual image of Kennedy eating some kind of four-legged animal that was originally reported to be a dog. He has, however, disputed this, claiming it was not a dog, it was a goat, which is not much better in my opinion. It looks rancid. It looks like something from Star Wars. It looks otherworldly, man. Or maybe he got the worm from his disgusting car. I mean, why not? As Olivia Nuzzi wrote, an intelligencer, nothing could have prepared me for the sight of that thing, talking about his car. Rearview mirrors smashed to bits, seatbelts chewed off, cushions gnawed open, filth and dog hair covering every surface. The death machine smelled so bad, I thought I might pass out after about 15 seconds riding shotgun. While Kennedy himself has speculated he got the worm during his travels to South Asia, he has also joked that it might have been from the bear cub. After all, he did stick his hand inside its brain. He's still like, yeah, I'm totally fine, man. Of course I can debate. He even boldly stated he could eat 5 more brain worms and still beat Trump and Biden, saying, and I quote, "I feel confident of the result, even with a 6-worm handicap." Now, I don't know about
Unfortunately, a banger. Unfortunately, that's hard. That's hard as hell. just directly quoting your own fucking nonsense goes crazy. That's pretty fucking funny.
the debate, but he'd certainly destroy any opponent in an eating roadkill competition.
It was very good condition, and I was gonna put the meat in my refrigerator, and you can do that in New York State. You can get a bear tag for a roadkill bear.
But first, let's talk about today's sponsor, Fume. And yes, I did buy.
Sorry, get your bag.
RFK Jr. formally joined the 2024 presidential race in April 2023, and in August of this year, a few days before this video was originally scheduled to come out, he dropped out of the 2024 presidential race. Or he kind of did. On the 23rd, Kennedy gave a press conference officially declaring he was not ending his campaign, he was only suspending it, which in this case means he will be removing his name from the ballot in key swing states where he doesn't want to inadvertently help Kamala Harris win. Despite what he always said on the campaign trail, Kennedy went back on his word and endorsed Donald Trump, announcing he will be campaigning with him regularly from now on. I mean, he's so on board with Trump, some Republicans are just straight up pretending he's the new running mate, since Trump's actual running mate, J.D. Vance, is so historically unpopular. Kennedy has previously said he could not be further apart from Trump on governance and philosophies of leadership, someone he called a terrible person and probably a sociopath. I understand politics are messy, but I mean, those are some pretty strong words for a guy that you are now happily standing on stage with. He said he torpedoed the Constitution. I mean, what happened to those values, dude? Keep in mind, this deliberate attempt to hurt Kamala comes not even a week after he reportedly tried to ask her for a cabinet position. She ghosted him, and now suddenly here we are. Weird how that happened.
Putting it on my stream deck.
He still remains on the ballot in a lot of states because there is a non-zero chance he may end up the next attorney general or something if Trump wins, a CIA director, who knows, honestly. I think it's still worth exploring what it is Kennedy actually believes in, what his policies have been, and what his campaign looked like up until this point. Because according to the New Yorker, one of the biggest reasons behind his decision to throw his hat in the ring in the first place had to do with the fact that as a presidential candidate, they wouldn't be allowed to silence him. Who this spooky, ambiguous they character is, Kennedy doesn't really tell us, but we'll get to that. First, let's get some of his major policies out of the way. To put it mildly, Kennedy is all over the place. He's extremely tough on the southern border, which is, to put it mildly, Kennedy is all over the place. He's extremely tough on the southern border, which is right-wing, while also being the only candidate in the race currently advocating for billions of dollars in reparations for black farmers, which would be left-wing. He's called for an end to the forever wars waged around the planet, while also backing Israel's slaughter of Gaza, questioning the need for even a 6-week ceasefire. He's changed his position on abortion numerous times during the course of this very race, drawing confusion for members of his own staff. Hell, his running mate didn't even know what his position on abortion was until May, before he reportedly flipped his stance again. But let's take a moment here to explore some of the people who make up this campaign, which for the most part is depicted in the media as a who's who of creeps and conspiracy theorists. Allow me to give you a brief overview of all these characters. For starters, you've got Trent Poole, a 37-year-old ballot access consultant working close with the campaign, who was arrested this past April for violently assaulting a 25-year-old woman who he strangled, cutting off her airflow by wrapping his hand around her neck, making it hard for her to breathe, and then striking her in the face with a closed fist, according to what the NYPD told CNN. He was promptly charged with criminal obstruction of breathing and assault. Though standing by their employee, it looks like, the Kennedy campaign told CNN that he tells us that the alleged event never occurred, despite Mediaite also reporting an earlier incident from February of this year, where he was arrested for 4th-degree assault in Seattle. This is a dude that the campaign kinda needs. As Mediaite states, he's been working diligently with the campaign's ballot access director, Nicholas Brana, to get Kennedy on the ballot in all 50 states, which they've just about done. Speaking of Brana, The New Yorker also wrote that 2 years earlier, he was accused of forcing himself onto a female colleague, corroborated by a witness who claimed to have walked in on the alleged assault. The New Yorker also makes sure to clarify that both Brana and Poole have...
Back off, guys. He's got lust demons. He's got lust demons, dude. Leave him alone.
Characterize these claims as false and or politically motivated. According to the Wall Street Journal, when a ballot access director by the name of Christine Kramer voiced her concern for Brana hanging around despite the allegation, Kennedy's HR department essentially told her their hands were tied and they couldn't do anything because the alleged event took place before he joined their campaign. As a result of their inaction, Christine began looking for another job. That same Wall Street Journal article, which is based on interviews with over a dozen current and former staffers, includes a myriad of quotes and testimonies from disillusioned members of Kennedy's campaign. One former employee telling the Journal the place was rife with grifters and opportunists, concerned that if someone's going to do that to their campaign, how do I know they won't do that in their administration? Additionally revealing that Kennedy had hired a man named Jamel Hawley, who has literally been charged with ballot tampering in a previous election, and that concerns me. Kennedy wants the keys to the most powerful nation in the world, and he can't even have the basic foresight to not hire staff members with such horrifying rap sheets. At least care about the optics, man. Come on. One of his closest advisors, Charles Eisen.
You know, I just clocked this. This guy sounds like an in-between of Matt Pat and Charlie. Like, he sounds like Matt Pat, and then when he starts getting worked up, it kind of sounds like Slimesicle as well. Like, it sounds like he goes between them.
Was being paid 5 figures to work on the campaign while at the same time reportedly telling aides that he had 1 foot out the door, concerning some staff members who believed certain Kennedy insiders were merely using the candidate for their own personal gain. What they could possibly stand to theoretically gain from a person like RFK Jr. is, to quote Kennedy, beyond my level of expertise. But the internal chaos has led to some pretty eye-catching moments in the tabloids. According to page 6, one Kennedy press dinner from last summer exploded into a farting match between this guy and this guy. When this guy loudly proclaimed climate change to be a hoax, this guy fired back with a barrage of verbal insults, calling him fucking insane and insignificant, to which this guy retaliated by, and I quote, ripping out a loud, prolonged fart while yelling, "I'm farting." While page 6 was unable to confirm whether or not he was farting at his opponent personally, or just the prospect of climate change in general, they say one thing was for certain, that the climate changed in the immediate environs of the dinner table. A major common denominator you tend to find with the people Kennedy surrounds himself with is a tendency for them to believe in alternative alternative explanations for the world around us.
Crazy, bro.
Conspiracy theories. I'm talking about conspiracy theories. And I don't mean the fun ones like Area 51 or the Denver airport or whatever. I mean the ones that rely on pure fear and are entirely politically motivated. Let's look at Eisenstein first. Again, this guy has worked closely with the Kennedy campaign since last year. The New Yorker reported that in 2021, Eisenstein wrote a Substack article where he compared unvaccinated people to historical scapegoats, including Jews in Europe. Admitting to the magazine, that one really got me canceled. Then you've got Del Bigtree, the founder of an anti-vax group who ended up in the news for wearing a yellow Star of David because the media was attacking him for railing against the measles vaccine. And who could forget the several members of his campaign who have expressed sympathy for the January 6 rioters, including Kennedy himself, by the way, who has even suggested pardoning insurrectionists if he ever got into office, hiring a man to work on his social media team who appeared to be at the Capitol that day. What he was doing up there at the time, we don't really know. Then you've got Ty and Charlene Bollinger, two QAnon act there at the time, we don't really know.
What the hell is this? Is he wearing like a mask, but like...
No. Then you've got Ty and Charlene Bollinger, two QAnon activists who have financial ties to Kennedy and have also invited him to speak at anti-vax events. In addition to stating there is no COVID-19 pandemic, Ty was also in Washington on January 6th and reportedly stood at the doors of the Capitol waiting to get in, according to the Associated Press. Kennedy's appeal among fringe conspiracy theorists isn't so much of a mystery when you start to parse through some of the things he said during his many podcast appearances alongside fellow public intellectuals. The stump speeches he usually gives on the campaign trail aren't nearly as controversial as you may think. Kennedy deliberately tones down his rhetoric on the road, and there's a reason for that. He knows deep down that normal voters are not gonna respond as favorably to his more offbeat takes, so he reserves his edgier views for safer spaces. These more unorthodox beliefs are less so based on actual undisputed facts and research and rely more on emotional, fear-infused anecdotes than anything else. Let's look at some examples. Here's Kennedy warning modern-day philosopher Joe Rogan about the dangers of Wi-Fi radiation caused by cell phones, which he says it breaks down your blood-brain barrier and leads to cancer.
I mean, there's cell phone tumors.
So what is
He didn't write that down, guys. Have a
There's a lot of people with it. They're glioblastomas. That's the kind of cancers.
Unable to provide an exact number for the amount of people inflicted by this form of cell phone cancer, Jamie pulls up a website, one that's tied to Kennedy by the way, that confirms Wi-Fi is in fact dangerous to humans. This is enough to convince Joe, of course, a man with a superhuman ability to adopt the beliefs of whoever he's sitting across at a given moment. But scientific experts, i.e. not Kennedy, who is a lawyer, argue that this is not a claim backed by definitive scientific research.
The podcast.
In fact, studies show the energy from our phones is simply too low for it to pose any threat to our DNA. This has to do with the radiation being non-ionizing. Non-ionizing radiation is considered low frequency and low energy and exists in stark contrast to ionizing radiation.
Let's say if this was the case, like TVs would do it, my monitors would be doing it, this camera would be doing it, radio would do it.
Radiation, which is the kind of radiation involved in X-rays.
You probably just heard radiation.
This is the kind of radiation you have to be careful with. It is harmful, but that is why there are so many precautions involved in dealing with it. Kennedy fails here to distinguish between these two types of radiation, but that distinction makes all the difference. The source that Jamie pulls up here makes a lot of bold claims. Most of the studies it relies on are over 10 years old and haven't been verified by other parties. As one expert told PolitiFact, Kennedy and the Environmental Health Trust were cherry-picking results that support their cause without considering the research's quality, contradictory evidence, or whether the research is relevant to the radio frequency signal levels people are exposed to from standard Wi-Fi. In other words, this one website shouldn't be enough to convince anyone of anything.
Oh, we gotta get rid of Wi-Fi. What the fuck, Jamie?
Joe, you're not gonna do that, and even if you did get rid of Wi-Fi, you wouldn't have a fucking show, nor would RFK have a platform to spew his favorite unfounded claims.
We've always had abundance of guns in this country. In the past 20 years, there's been no per capita increase in the amount of guns we have.
I'm gonna stop him right there, because what he just did is lie. According to data from the ATF, both gun manufacturing and gun imports have increased roughly 10% each year over the last decade. There has absolutely absolutely been a per capita increase in the number of guns we have in this country. And that increase even lines up with a rise in gun deaths according to the trace. But instead of talking about any of that pesky data, Kennedy would rather speculate that America's school shootings may have to do with
What, more guns equal more gun death? No. Let these people protect themselves. No. No way. Let Jerry David from West Virginia, I don't know if that's the name, have his 57th gun for his safety. It's a deagle.
Depressants or video games.
NIH has not studied the etiology or the cause of gun violence since 1996. And NIH needs to be studying them to see if there's connections to some of the SSRI and psychiatric drugs people are taking, whether there's connection to video games.
There's a few things wrong with what he just said there. If you're wondering what the hell he's talking about, Kennedy has also spoken about it on Twitter, writing that Congress prohibits the National Institutes of Health from researching the cause of mass shootings. Under my administration, that ends. And I must admit, that would be a pretty easy dub for his administration, since the rule doesn't exist. It is true that in 1996, Congress passed something called the Dickey Amendment, which in a nutshell was an appropriations bill provision that federal officials widely interpreted as barring federally funded research related to gun violence, though some observers say this was a misinterpretation. Congress in 2018 clarified that the provision didn't bar federally funded gun-related research, and funding for such efforts has been flowing since 2020, according to the KFF, a non-profit organization focused on health policy. Kennedy is talking about an outdated provision that arguably never even prevented research from happening in the first place. It was initially brought about by groups like the NRA to hamper the government from looking into the root cause of gun violence. But after Congress officially changed the language, KFF reports that the CDC, NIH, and other federal agencies have poured millions of dollars into gun-related research, including the largest study of mass shootings to date. The fact that Kennedy would use such outdated information to influence his position really makes me question whether or not he's fit to be anywhere near a position of power, much less the presidency. And that's not even scratching the surface of what some of his other baseless theories are, like chemicals in the water are turning the kids trans, COVID-19 is a bioweapon from China, and that ivermectin treats it, which is just a blatant lie. Even the type of ivermectin used on humans wouldn't have any effect on a virus like coronavirus because it's used to treat parasites, worms. Maybe RFK Jr. could use some. He dabbles in the kind of conspiracies you might hear over the holidays when you're forced to endure the deranged ramblings of your crazy Uncle Barry. In fact, there's a good chance that good old Uncle Barry may have gotten some of those ideas straight from RFK Jr. Considering the sheer volume of misinformation Kennedy's organization has spread across social media. Fun fact, Kennedy makes up a small group of 12 or so influencers that one report found responsible for pushing up to 2/3 of all anti-vaccine content across Facebook and Instagram. Awesome! Kennedy was considered one of 2 buyers accounting for 54% of anti-vaccine advertising content on Facebook, according to The Guardian, making it a little hard for me to believe his recent claim that he has never been an anti-vaxxer.
I see somebody on a hiking trail carrying a little baby, and I say to him, better not get him vaccinated. And he heard that from me. If he hears it from 10 other people, maybe he won't do it. Maybe he will save that child.
Kennedy has waged a lengthy and costly crusade against vaccines that started 2 decades ago, when a mother arrived at his doorstep with some documents and a mission. By Kennedy's own account, this woman would not leave him alone until he heard her argument that mercury in vaccines were to blame for her son's
does have an effect on some viruses, but not the specific kind of virus that COVID is, due to the fact that it never interacts with the nucleus of the cell.
There are also varying types of ivermectin, and the stuff that people wanted to take in America was fucking horse tranquilizer or horse medicine. So, ivermectin is a broad term for a various amount of pills, but the one that they were specifically talking about was an anti-parasitic one, which does not touch a virus, just in case that's unclear. Just in case that's unclear, a virus does not get affected by a medicine used to fight a parasite. Two different things. Two separate things. You would need an antiviral drug, not an antiparasitic. Anyway, I'm sure I don't actually need to tell any of you that, but
of papers to pore over, but it didn't take long to convince him. Not only had Kennedy experienced mercury poisoning himself from eating too much tuna sandwiches, remember, but his work as an environmental lawyer also allowed him to witness the harm large levels of mercury can have on the planet. As scientist Jonathan Jerry put it, Kennedy, who was already familiar with mercury's effect on ecosystems, was alarmed and started calling regulators. He became convinced they either did not understand what vaccine science was allegedly saying, or they were lying. See, you have to understand that at this time, vaccine skepticism was rearing its ugly head throughout Europe and America, thanks to a disgraced gut doctor by the name of Andrew Wakefield, widely considered to be the grandfather of the contemporary anti-vax movement.
This is the only guy, this is the only research that spun this whole thing, by the way. This is the one thing that snowballed this entire rhetoric.
Wakefield's name might sound familiar if you've seen this video, which I've linked down below in case you want to watch H Bomber Guy absolutely rip his study to shreds, but for now, here's an extremely abbreviated history lesson. In 1998, Wakefield published a now defunct study that connected the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine to autism in young children. He was hired to do this by a lawyer looking to take vaccine manufacturers to court on behalf of families who thought there was some kind of mystical link between MMR vaccines and their child's autism. This link has never actually existed, mind you, which is why they needed an official study to point to in court to help their argument. Wakefield was paid good money to conduct that very study and did everything he could to ensure he reached a very specific conclusion, even if that meant lying about the patients he observed, tampering with data, and even physically abusing some of the children in the process with unnecessarily invasive and dangerous medical procedures. Hell, despite what he claimed, not all of these kids even had autism. But the media didn't know that. The media ran wild with the result of this study because it was a flashy story that garnered outrage and attention. But experts were always skeptical, especially after Wakefield began trying to sell an alternative to the MMR vaccine that he had patented, along with a guy who wanted to put his bone marrow in pills that would cure autism, but that's a detail. No other researchers ever came close to replicating the same results that Wakefield had found, and in 2010 he had his medical license officially revoked by an ethics board that ruled he had acted dishonestly and irresponsibly. The Lancet, the scientific journal that had originally published his incorrect paper, retracted it and told The Guardian that it was utterly clear, without any ambiguity at all, that the statements in the paper were utterly false. Despite all of this, Wakefield continues to maintain his innocence and has never stopped saying that vaccines cause autism. He managed to garner a small but dedicated following of people who bought into the media's scary depiction of vaccines during that brief window of time his study was taken seriously, and that following has remained by his side to this day. Andrew Wakefield is a dangerous con man who lied to the press, his fellow scientists, and the public, all for some quick cash. He should never, under any circumstance, be taken seriously by anyone ever. Anyway, here's RFK Jr. saying we should build a statue of him.
In any just society, we would be building a statue to Andy Wakefield.
This is just one of the many times Kennedy has made an appearance at an anti-vax rally in recent years, as it seems he's made it his life's goal to spread Wakefield's research as far and wide as he can. Kicking off his activism in 2005 when he wrote this article titled Deadly Immunity for Rolling Stone and Salon.com, both of which have issued full retractions of the paper, and they did so for good reason. In it, Kennedy completely mischaracterizes the nature of a CDC event on vaccine safety, cherry-picking quotes, quotes and stripping away context to make the event out to be some kind of secret supervillain meetup where evil doctors try to brainstorm ways they can hide the destructive effects of vaccines from the public. Never mind the fact that the transcript of this event is public, released by the CDC. Kennedy was especially concerned about the presence of thimerosal in childhood vaccines. And let's just take a pause here so we're all on the same page. Thimerosal, according to the FDA, is a mercury-containing organic compound that has been used both here in the US and around the world as a preservative that protects medical products from a potentially life-threatening contamination. It's been used since the 1930s and has a proven track record of being safe. A postdoctoral fellow at UT Health San Antonio described how it works in a little more detail in his book, Anti-Vaxxers: How to Challenge a Misinformed Movement. As Berman puts it, thimerosal makes use of a property of heavy metals, causing them to react with certain amino acids of bacterial proteins in a way that kills bacteria. The controversy concerning thimerosal targeted one of the atoms present in the compound, mercury. But as he explains, mercury is harmful to humans when it is inorganic, when it is not bonded to carbon atoms. The mercury found in thimerosal takes the form of ethyl mercury, which is different than methyl mercury, the type of mercury that can be toxic to humans in large doses. We are talking about two different forms of mercury here.
Yeah.
Elements on the periodic table of elements are considered safe in some circumstances and dangerous in others. I mean,
yeah, I mean, it's not like chemistry. One single molecule changes and it's an entirely different and dangerous thing, right?
That's just how it works. This isn't the case with just mercury. Exhaustive research shows ethyl mercury does not pierce your cell membrane the same way methyl mercury does. Ethyl mercury is also excreted from the body much quicker. Overwhelming studies show that ethyl mercury is far less likely than methyl mercury
it's not
to
like the
accumulate in your
slightest
body
adjustment
and
of chemical
harm.
compounds can change something dramatically.
There's no need to worry because thimerosal hasn't even been used in the overwhelming majority of vaccines since 2001 out of an absolute abundance of caution. Today, you can only find it in one version of the flu shot, and that's it. It was largely phased out by the time Kennedy sat down to write this article in 2005, mostly because people like him pressured the FDA to act despite there not being any actual evidence of risk, according to Berman. Since this decision, countless studies have been conducted, none of which have found any consistent statistic link between thimerosal exposure and neurodevelopment disorders, according to Berman. But that hasn't stopped Kennedy's crusade.
Say all my words.
In fact, his activity has only ramped up since 2020, when a little thing called COVID happened. At a time when most Americans were finally learning who Anthony Fauci was, Kennedy had already been railing against the country's top medical advisor for years. Before running for president, Kennedy was acting chair of the Children's Health Defense, a registered 501c3 nonprofit that has been credited with focusing almost entirely on spreading anti-vaccine rhetoric online. While the organization had been founded all the way back in 2007 by a different guy, Eric Gladen, nobody really paid much attention to it until Kennedy joined the cause in 2015. Kennedy's glamorous status as Kennedy likely elevated their legitimacy in the eyes of the public, as evident by a massive upswing in donations that year. According to the Associated Press, the CHD, which at the time was called the World Mercury Project, went from reporting $13,000 in revenue on tax filings in 2014 to $467,000 in 2015. Gladen likened Kennedy to a machine, someone who was really passionate about getting out there and doing seminars, spitting out articles left and right. When Gladen stepped down in 2016, Kennedy soon took over as both chairman and chief legal counsel. Before long, they had branched out into a fully scaled up network, spewing unfounded information on vaccines across their newsletters, ebooks, and even documentaries, produced by their very own studio. All of this and more became possible after a continuous rise in their gross revenue. Though in 2017, Kennedy told Tucker Carlson that shifting his focus towards vaccines was probably the worst career move he's ever made, reiterating that he was not getting paid for it. Filings tell a different story, however. That Kennedy was actually being paid $131,000 by the CHD in 2017, with that number only skyrocketing thanks to COVID. Their website went from getting 140,000 impressions every month before COVID to over 4 million during the height of the pandemic. The New York Times reported more recently that the CHD's most profitable year happened in 2021, when their annual annual revenue almost reached a whopping $16 million, almost a net $10 million increase from their previous year. According to the Times, Kennedy reportedly made over $500,000 as chairman that year. So I would personally argue he kind of has a vested interest in pushing a very specific narrative, even when it goes against the general consensus of the medical community. One of, if not probably the only thing I have in common with RFK Jr. is the fact that I am not a scientist. I am not a doctor. This may be surprising, but I do not have a PhD. I studied film in college, okay? My homework was watching movies. This is not my expertise. Unlike Kennedy, I am radical enough to actually trust the countless health experts around the world who devote their entire lives to studying vaccines and infectious diseases. I know that might sound wild. You call me a sheeple. Dr. Dan Wilson, a molecular biologist and science communicator, has devoted his entire YouTube channel to debunking medical conspiracy theories. In this video, Dr. Wilson goes into extreme detail, taking on all the various lies Kennedy regurgitates to Joe Rogan. And yes, this is also the same episode where he talks about cell phone cancer.
None of the vaccines are ever subjected to true placebo-controlled trials.
I have to do this so he doesn't claim me. Sorry.
Here we see Kennedy telling Joe that vaccines are not placebo tested, which, as Dr. Wilson insists, is simply not the case. Vaccines are, in fact, among the most rigorously tested medical products in existence. And as Dr. Wilson points out, this means they absolutely are required to go through placebo-controlled trials before going to market. The idea that they wouldn't is just insane. I mean, would that not pose a massive liability? As Dr. Wilson explains, placebo trials have been a routine part of vaccine testing for generations.
Every first vaccine before it goes to market is tested in randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trials. The polio vaccine trials back in 1954 were famously randomized, double-blind, and saline placebo-controlled, all the way up to just a few years ago, where COVID vaccine clinical trials were famously randomized, double-blind, and saline placebo-controlled.
Kennedy also makes the bold assertion here that vaccine manufacturers are immune from being sued because the government protects them. But this, as Dr. Wilson argues once again, is just another total fabrication. Why is it a total fabrication? Well, because Kennedy has sued vaccine manufacturers himself. Wilson technically doesn't even have to say anything here. Kennedy has already tanked his own argument.
They passed the Vaccine Act in 1986, and the Vaccine Act gave immunity from liability to all vaccine companies. No matter how negligent you are, no matter how reckless your conduct, no matter how toxic the ingredient, how shoddily tested or manufactured the product, your vaccine company, you cannot be sued.
Nothing in the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program or any relevant law says that vaccine manufacturers are immune from negligence or fraud. Kennedy knows that he is lying because he himself has sued Merck multiple times over their HPV vaccine. He is suing vaccine manufacturers because he claims that they are committing fraud and negligence. He's doing what he says isn't allowed.
We could honestly do this all day, but the last thing I want to bring up is this clip from later on in the podcast, where Kennedy goes so far as to suggest the Spanish flu was caused by vaccines. I am very literally not even sure what to make of this.
You know, not a definitive, but very, very strong evidence. The Spanish flu was vaccine-induced flu. The deaths were vaccine-induced.
The Spanish flu was vaccine-induced? Well, God, flu vaccines weren't even around during the 1918 flu. Is he saying that smallpox vaccines caused a flu pandemic? I mean, what? This is crazy. I don't know. Robert always has a way of surprising me with how wacky he goes.
I've linked to Dr. Wilson's channel down below and would highly suggest you check out some of his other content. It's all extremely well structured and easy to follow. Would very much recommend if you want to know more about the intricacies of vaccine misinformation and how it can spread, what are the falsehoods and how we can debunk them. With the kind of influence Kennedy wields these days, I think it's important we amplify the voices of actual scientists, people who know what they're talking about, people who aren't bad faith cranks looking to gain political power and social relevancy. In other words, not Kennedy, who spouts shit like this.
Even in Hitler's Germany, you
You can cross the Alps into Switzerland. You can hide in an attic like Anne Frank did.
I mean, sometimes I just have to assume the worm hijacked his brain and is in control of the words that come out of his mouth, because what is he talking about?
What does that even mean?
An influential figure comparing unvaccinated people to Anne Frank and implying that Anne Frank had it better than them is so mind-blowing that even his third wife, Cheryl Hines, yes, Larry David's wife on Curb Your Enthusiasm, had to make a statement of her own, distancing herself from her husband. Fun fact, but apparently it was Larry David who originally set Kennedy up with Hines years ago and has since advised her to break up with him as his behavior has gotten increasingly more insane.
I'm covered with ladybugs.
Which, and I cannot possibly stress this enough, literally sounds like something out of Curb. I honestly can't tell if he's saying some of this stuff.
It kind of does, yeah.
Or if he really is this delusional. Maybe a combination of both. It just seems like he'll say anything for some donations, even going so far as to offer the chance to win a visit to the Kennedy compound in Cape Cod if you just donate enough. In one ad, he tells people, there's always plenty of people and good conversation. If my mom decides to come, adventure is guaranteed. I cannot express to you how fucking lame that is, but it's also incredibly invasive and exploitative of his own family's name, pissing off his relatives to the point that they made him retract the offer. So I'm not really sure if anyone got to visit or not, but I'll tell you where Kennedy got to visit, and that's Samoa.
Yeah, we're still not done. It's
Parents
crazy.
are being told to urgently vaccinate their children to protect them from a measles epidemic that's sweeping the Pacific Island nation.
In 2018, the World Health Organization noticed a concerning drop in vaccination rates across the oceanic country of Samoa. They observed that only 31% of infants received the measles shot that year, a considerable drop compared to previous years. The WHO determined that this newfound anxiety was linked to 2 infants that had died within hours of receiving the MMR vaccine. Parents were worried these deaths had something to do with the contents of the vaccine, and so was the government, temporarily halting their vaccine program out of an abundance of caution until they could figure out what went wrong. Upon further investigation, though, they learned the truth, that these tragic deaths were caused by 2 nurses who improperly mixed the vaccines with an expired liquid muscle relaxant instead of water. It was a horrifying accident that had nothing to do with the vaccines themselves.
Jeez.
But that's not what some would have you believe.
Samoa, 2018, 2 babies were given the MMR. Can you tell us your version of that story?
I don't remember it well enough.
Kennedy used the uptick in skepticism to his advantage, the CHD making numerous posts where they continued to question the safety of the vaccines given to those infants and reportedly kept those posts up even after the true cause was revealed. As one New Zealand vaccinologist, Dr. Helen Pedoesis Harris, told the Washington Post, the public was never told for months that it wasn't the vaccine that killed the babies,
what a
which
name.
really was the most important message. Misinformation continued to run rampant throughout the country, and in 2019, Kennedy flew out to the island to meet with the Prime Minister himself. Being treated as a distinguished guest, the AP reported that Kennedy met with high-ranking members of the government, as well as his friends in anti-vaccine advocacy groups. A member of one of these groups even wrote at the time that Kennedy's appearance was profoundly monumental for their movement. Then, the country took a turn for the worst, suffering a massive measles outbreak that killed 83 people, mostly women and children. The Washington Post reported at the time that the overwhelming majority of those hospitalized were children, with the country's health minister stating the children are quite ill. Our ICUs have been dominated by these children. According to Pedoesis Harris, who worked on the government's response to the crisis, Samoan anti-vax groups took their cues from Kennedy, telling the AP they amplified the fear and mistrust, which resulted in the amplification of the epidemic and an increased number of children dying. Children were being brought for care too late. Even the children that do survive a measles diagnosis run the risk of developing future infections later on in life per the NIH. Despite the
Which is why the measles can't be fucked with. We get vaccinated because it has ramifications past it.
Anti-vaxxers' relentless attempts to slow them down, the government was eventually able to contain the spread only by rolling out an emergency vaccine program, which of course angered some of the Samoan activists Kennedy had worked with. These guys erroneously claimed that it was the vaccines responsible for the outbreak, an unfounded theory that Kennedy himself later repeated in a letter of his own to the Prime Minister in 2019. One of those activists was eventually arrested in Samoa for spreading misinformation. Their laws are little different than ours, but he was eventually released, prompting Kennedy to praise him as a medical freedom hero, as someone who stood up to the global medical cartel, while also referring to the outbreak that killed 83 people and infected thousands as mild. When pressed in a PBS documentary for his role in the spread of misinformation on the island, Kennedy severely downplayed his involvement by telling filmmakers, "I had nothing to do with people not vaccinating in Samoa. I never told anybody not to vaccinate. I didn't go there with any reason to do that." In another statement, however, Kennedy said he met with the Prime Minister to implement a system that would, in his words, measure health outcomes following the natural experiment created by a national respite from vaccines. A natural experiment? For a guy who claims to care so much about the planet, he really doesn't seem to care much about the people on it.
What's unsettling about it is, again, I've covered this man for a decade, and when you go to these anti-vaccine marches, you see hundreds and thousands of people who are just enamored with him, right? They believe whatever he says. You know, he's done a lot of real harm.
After so many hours of researching a man whose life has been so heavily documented for so many decades, I can promise you that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is an incredibly flawed, tragic, out-of-touch, manipulative, destructive piece of shit who really should not be admired by anyone, much less appointed anywhere near the presidency. And I say that because we know he wants some kind of cabinet position. He previously tried to get Trump on board with him heading a commission on vaccine safety and scientific integrity. Trump's team denied this at the time, and the commission never materialized, but it very well could see a resurgence during a second Trump term, especially now that the 45th president more or less owes him a favor. In my mind, Kennedy has proven himself too dangerous to be taken seriously. His involvement in sowing scientific skepticism in Samoa is horrifying, and his efforts to sow the same kind of unfounded mistrust of vaccines here in the US is worth mentioning too. In 2021, NPR reported that Kennedy's CHD had released a new documentary that used the Tuskegee experiment to promote vaccine hesitancy among African American communities during the peak of COVID. This is a massive false equivalency, as opposed to the Tuskegee experiment, which saw the government denying proper medical treatment to black people. The COVID vaccine is strongly recommended by every health institution there is. But Kennedy's documentary goes so far as to imply that black people don't need the COVID shot, asserting that they already have enough immunity and that the vaccine might cause too much immunity. A claim that is so utterly unfounded, I really can't put into words how gross it is. He is exploiting the very real and justified mistrust that targeted communities might have toward the federal government to his own advantage. He is trying to bring more people into this anti-vax cult by any means necessary. It's no wonder so much of his own family has denounced him over the years. In 2019, several of his relatives published an op-ed in Politico clarifying that they did not stand by his dangerous rhetoric. More recently, you have Jack Schlossberg calling his cousin a prick and his campaign an embarrassment to the family's legacy, considering him nothing more than a stalking horse for Trump even before Kennedy suspended his campaign to support him. In 2020, his own niece, who is a doctor herself, wrote in the New York Times that although she loves her uncle, his stance on vaccines is just plain wrong. She's a scientist, he's a lawyer. Who do you want to trust more? And these are not his only family members to speak out against him either, which I can't imagine is easy for them to do. Through his own irresponsibility and carelessness, RFK Jr. has made the world a more dangerous place and isolated himself from those who knew and loved him more than anyone. But in a way, being ostracized from the rest of his family may make him even more appealing in the eyes of some conspiracy theorists who themselves have been alienated from their families, which is depressing. So where can we hope to go from here?
I've had friends who became anti-vaxxers as well, and I think I made more progress with them through having two-way conversations where I listened to their point of view and then shared my point of view. Ultimately, you can't reach into someone's brain and fix them. You know, you have to help them and create a safe social environment for them to change themselves.
A big component of Dr. Jonathan Berman's book pertains to how we may be able to prevent our friends and family from falling falling down the same pipeline of vaccine misinformation that RFK Jr. has long promoted. To Berman, this boils down to three main strategies, which he characterizes as reactive, information deficit, and community-based. The reactive approach is the least effective, Berman argues, because it involves mocking anti-vaxxers and engaging in frivolous arguments with them online. And look, I know that can be tempting. I've made some jokes about Kennedy throughout this video, but I understand what Berman means when he explains the potential adverse effects of lashing out at someone who has made this such a massive part of who they are. Berman argues when opposition to vaccination becomes attached to a person's identity and values, contradictory information can feel like an attack, which leads him to his next strategy, which he calls the information deficit approach.
And there you get the entirety of Trump's movement and everything. All of it's an identity. So when you make fun of people, which we do, I don't care. I'm a fucking Twitch streamer. I ain't changing the world like that. But when they take it personally, exactly. Like when people identify so heavily with a belief or a political stance or a conspiracy, going after such a thing in an insulting manner is basically spitting on them. It would be like if somebody asked my job, I said, I play video games. Pretty much what I do. I play video games. I'm a streamer, whatever. And if somebody were to just be like, that's fucking stupid. Just straight up, like lashing at a core piece of my identity. I'm much more than that. I'm a dynamic person, as we all should strive to be, and continue to do more and more things and be more dynamic. But it's still a core piece of me. It's tough because you don't want to fucking do all that. That's a lot of work, especially when you're trying to tell somebody they're being an idiot because they're believing something crazy, like a false medical article from a decade ago that was made because a guy got paid to make it up to make court look good for a family who wanted to sue because their child was different and they didn't like that. So, I don't know.
This involves simply pointing to the thousands and thousands of studies that have been conducted over the years showing there is absolutely zero link between vaccines and neurological disorders. For this, I've linked a massive database down below that contains countless studies proving how safe vaccines are. It's searchable and was compiled by molecular biologist and YouTuber Dr. Dan Wilson. It's useful and I'd highly recommend it for anyone looking to learn more about vaccines. Same with Berman's book, though I understand it can still be hard to convince those who have already developed such a strong connection to the issue. If you've already determined that the vast majority of medical professionals are lying to you, then you're probably going to have a hard time getting behind their research. Yep. Berman considers this to be more useful than the reactive approach, though, especially for those with surface-level doubts, but can still prove ineffective in convincing someone who is deeply entrenched in misinformation. This leads us to community-based strategies, which Berman believes to be the most effective way of getting through to even the most heavily indoctrinated individuals. Berman theorizes that once people begin to see more and more of their own peers getting themselves and their children vaccinated and are not experiencing any of the adverse health effects that they've heard about from people like Kennedy, their anxiety begins to dissipate. They start to see for themselves that maybe there is nothing to be afraid of after all. Berman goes into more detail about this phenomenon towards the end of his book, citing a multitude of examples he's observed over the years, but maintains that this requires time, patience, and a certain level of open-mindedness. I would like to personally believe that this open-mindedness can be achieved over time. I mean, look around. Over 270 million people have received the COVID shot, and as a result, we haven't had to deal with nationwide lockdowns in years. It is a wonderful thing. If there were some horrible, dangerous implications attached to the COVID vaccine causing death and destruction like Kennedy Kennedy has claimed, we would see evidence of that. And no, I'm not talking about an 86-year-old professional baseball player dying in his sleep of natural causes weeks after getting vaccinated. Yeah, immediately after Hank Aaron's death, Kennedy took to Twitter to insinuate it must have had something to do with the vaccine, which of course there is no evidence of. Hell, it's been years and this tweet is somehow still up, which really underlines the kind of shameless con artist Kennedy has always been. The more you learn about RFK Jr., the more you start to understand why the bulk of his massive family no longer wants anything to do with him. And sure, Kennedy may like to evoke Camelot nostalgia as a way to further his own self-serving and dangerous interests, but I can't imagine his uncle would be okay with that. In case you didn't know, President John F. Kennedy was a massive proponent of the polio vaccine in the early 60s and heavily encouraged the American public to go out and get it the second it became available, demonstrating at least some basic awareness for the safety and well-being of the general population. And for someone seeking to possess such immense political power, that really should be the bare minimum.
I say something in Mackay and you say gulp. Get out of my head and stinking up the fishing spots. Dude, I genuinely got jump scared be seeing you say gulp them out.
Put your hands up to the ceiling.
Wow, what a video. What a video. What a masterfully concise video. And it's still 80 minutes. But like, wow, I mean, he really covered a lot. And it's still a tail, like I'm still, my head's spinning.